On January 9th, 1888, when the noon thermometer nailed to the Coldwater freight shed read 6 degrees above zero, and a dry wind drove powder snow along Front Street like sifted flour, Kane Caldwell brought 2 freight wagons off the North Trail and stopped beside the rail spur where timber ended and prairie began. Coldwater held 327 souls by the church census, a rail-end settlement in Wyoming Territory, with 1 church, 1 schoolhouse, 1 boarding house, and a strip of new clapboard buildings that looked sturdy only until real winter tested their seams. Smoke from stovepipes leaned east in sharp gray bands. The stock pens were rimed white. Men in wool coats stamped their boots and calculated feed costs aloud, as if arithmetic itself might hold back weather. Kane spoke to no one at first. He climbed down, checked the chestnut mule team, and put his gloved palm against each wagon wheel hub, feeling for heat and loose iron. He had traveled through 3 nights of hard cold to reach this place, and he had not come to speculate, preach, or ask favor. He had come to build for weather that had not yet arrived. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and spare through the waist from years of lifting grain sacks and cut timber, with a beard gone prematurely pale at the chin and hands, marked by old burns from stovework and kettle iron. His papers listed him as a cooper by trade and a widower by circumstance, though the second title had shaped him more deeply than the first. 3 years earlier in Omaha, fever had taken his wife, Elsbeth Caldwell, in 11 days, beginning with cough and ending in quiet breaths that grew shallower each night while river traffic outside their room carried on, as though nothing had altered in the world. She had been born to Finnish settlers who had crossed first to Michigan timber camps and then westward with freight contracts, and from her mother and grandmother, she had learned the winter disciplines of households that survived, where snow stood shoulder high and darkness lasted long enough to test the mind. She did not call those methods secrets. She called them ordinary duties performed early. In the final week of her illness, when speech came in short intervals, she had Kane bring ledgers and school copybooks to the bedside. He wrote while she dictated. She ordered the pages by season, by wind direction, by fuel type, by failures observed in neighbors who trusted luck and plaster, and by remedies that did not fail when done with exactness. She set down wall assemblies, vent heights, stove clearances, meat curing ratios, grain rotation intervals, and warning signs in birds and cloud grain that marked pressure collapse before instruments confirmed it. Near the end, she had him read every page aloud and correct every misplaced figure. Then she told him to keep adding to the notebooks because weather changed its face but not its appetite. He carried those notebooks now in an oilcloth chest wedged between tool crates in the second wagon, wrapped again in waxed linen, then in a deerskin sleeve stitched by Elsbeth herself. Nothing in his load rode with greater protection. The first wagon held ironwork, cut plank, nails, stove lengths, sacks of lime, rendered tallow in stone jars, and 2 boxed barometers purchased secondhand from a survey team disbanded in Cheyenne. The remaining space held seed potatoes, beans, flour, cured pork, lamp chimneys, spare harness, and a narrow cot frame disassembled and labeled. 1 mule had a healing sore at the collar, and Kane adjusted the padding before he asked the land clerk a single question. By that evening, he had purchased a narrow lot along the North Rise for $42 in coin and promissory note, a strip others had passed over because the ground was dense with clay and gravel and required hard labor before any foundation could be cut. Kane chose it for exactly that reason. Loose loam shifted under frost. Clay held shape when carved and tamped. Gravel drained meltwater away from walls if graded true. At dawn the next day, he paced the boundary in measured strides, set corner stakes, and marked an oblong footprint 18 feet by 24. Facing south by east, so low winter light could strike the doorside, while prevailing north winds hit a bermed rear wall. He worked in silence, except when he called to the mules, and even those commands were brief, practical, and without temper. Coldwater had seen strangers before, and by the third day the usual inquiries traveled through town with the usual certainty. Some said he had failed in Nebraska grain and was hiding debt. Some said he had come north for cheap land and would sell by spring. By the fourth day, when he began cutting into the rise rather than setting posts above it, speculation shifted into ridicule. Men passing with sled loads slowed to watch him dig a one-room structure half into earth, then stack double-plank walls with an empty cavity between them, wide enough to bury a hand and forearm. Children gathered at the edge of the lot and repeated what they heard at supper tables. Women carrying water paused and counted the thickness with narrowed eyes. No one had seen a dwelling begun like that in Coldwater, where pride favored visible height and painted facades. The loudest judgment came from Silas Pemberton, proprietor of Pemberton Mercantile, who stood on his porch in a dark broadcloth coat with horn buttons and gloves lined in rabbit fur, his beard trimmed square and his boots polished despite the mud. He had prospered on inbound rail inventories and outbound credit, and his confidence sat on him as plainly as his watch chain. When a teamster asked what he made of the buried walls, Silas answered in a voice meant to carry. He called it Caldwell's Sand Coffin, and he laughed once, short and hard, as if the name itself settled the matter. By nightfall, the phrase had reached the church steps. By Sunday, it had reached the schoolyard. Kane heard it each time he went for water or nails. He did not answer it. He measured, cut, and tamped. The method looked strange only to those who had never watched severe winter work done without ornament. Kane set outer plank courses first, true to line and braced with temporary crossmembers every 30 inches. He then erected the inner wall, leaving a clean 14-inch cavity around 3 sides and a 10-inch cavity on the sunward side where thermal gain would be greater. Into that space he poured dry river sand screened through 1/4-inch mesh to remove pebble pockets that might settle unevenly. Every 6 inches he tamped with a flat oak rammer until the fill gave a dull, compacted note under strike rather than a loose hiss. He recorded each course in a ledger: date, temperature, moisture condition, quantity filled. Moist sand froze and split boards. Dry sand stored heat and returned it slowly through the night. Elsbeth had written that line twice in her notebook margin. Kane had underlined it in iron gall ink. He said a stove flew through stone collars quarried upriver, each collar bedded in lime mortar and ash to absorb expansion without cracking plank. Around every seam he pressed a paste of slaked lime, sifted ash, and rendered tallow warm to spread but not run, then covered the joint with narrow batten strips pinned in place by hand-forged nails. Where the wall met the cut earth, he laid a drainage skirt of gravel and straw to carry thaw water downslope. The roof timbers were modest but heavy enough for load, pitched low, with an overhang that shielded the entry from direct drift. Inside, he planned no decorative partition, only purposeful arrangement: stove central, bunks against interior walls, storage bins raised on brick feet, and water casks along the south side, where daytime warmth delayed freezing. By the second week after his arrival, he had begun storing provisions in quantities that made neighbors shake their heads. He stacked 6 months of beans in canvas sacks, stitched and dipped in weak brine to deter weevil. He purchased flour in 50-pound lots and sealed it in pine bins lined with paper and tallowed cloth. He hung salt pork on iron hooks above a cool trench vent. He rendered and strained fat into crocks, labeled by date and source. He counted lamp oil by pint, not by guess. At dawn and dusk, regardless of fatigue, he stepped outside with notebook and thermometer, recording air temperature, wind direction, cloud form, and snow grain size where drifts gathered against the unfinished wall. If wind rose after sunset, he checked again at midnight. Those entries were not ritual. They were instruction obeyed. Elsbeth had told him, and he had written it in his own hand, that wind announced itself in sequence if a household listened with discipline. First in the heightened speed of upper cloud, then in bird roots, then in the texture of blown snow, and finally in a silence that came too complete to trust. Coldwater still judged winter by first hard frost and last green grass. Kane judged it by pressure, fuel, and wall mass. The difference between those systems had not yet become public consequence. In January of 1888, it was still called eccentricity, and a man could be mocked from a mercantile porch while he built the structure that would later keep a town alive. By the last week of October, the town enjoyed 7 straight afternoons above freezing, and on October 28, 1888, the thermometer outside Pemberton Mercantile rose to 51 degrees in the shade, which men treated as proof that caution had been wasted and that winter, if it came hard at all, would come late. Wagons rolled easier through slush than through crusted ruts. Children went bareheaded between lessons. Teams were watered at dusk without steam rising from their flanks. The calm was broad and bright, and because it made daily labor less punishing, it also made judgment soft. Kane watched the sky and did not soften with it. He noted geese crossing lower than their usual line, wings beating in tight, urgent cadence, not in the looser formation of ordinary migration. He marked maretails at noon, then marked them again an hour later. Flattened and combed east by high wind, no one felt at ground level. He lit a lamp in his dug room and observed the flame gutter twice in still air when no door had opened. Then he unpacked one of the survey barometers, checked it against the second, and wrote the reading in Elsbeth's ledger with a careful hand. Pressure falling too fast for a simple cold snap. He rode to town before supper, mule sweat drying white on harnessed leather by the time he tied off at the church rail. A council meeting was assembling in the side hall, called to discuss rail freight delays west of Laramie and whether the town should pool funds for a larger coal order while shipments still moved. Kane stood in the vestibule with his hat in both hands and frost beginning to silver his beard ends, though the evening remained mild, and asked leave to speak. Reverend Pike nodded him forward with visible reluctance. Silas Pemberton leaned back on a bench near the stove, one polished boot crossed over the other, watch chain bright against his vest. Kane did not perform urgency. He reported signs and numbers. He stated that upper wind, pressure drop, and bird movement agreed with one another, that a hard front could outrun the rail line, that if supply cars stalled west of the pass, Coldwater would face at least 3 weeks with whatever coal, flour, and lamp oil already stood in town. He proposed a communal root trench lined with sod, 42 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, with timber bracing at 4-foot intervals in 2 shared hatch points near the church and the school. He had drawn the plan on folded paper. Estimated cost was $118 for timber, nails, and sod cutting, plus 8 labor days if 20 men took half-day shifts. Silas laughed first, then spoke as though explaining accounts to a careless clerk. Panic was bad arithmetic, he said. Mild weather in late October had value. Sensible men used it to move stock and close books, not to bury produce like frightened badgers. He reminded the room that his store had regular coal arriving and enough lamp oil to meet ordinary demand. A proper clapboard house with faith in spring, he said, was safer than a grave full of beach sand. Several men smiled because the phrasing was sharp, and sharpness often passed for certainty. The council voted to postpone pooled purchase for 1 week and declined trench work as extravagant. Kane folded his paper, thanked them for hearing him, and left before rebuttal could become theater. Outside, he paused at the hitch rail while Ruthie Pike, the Reverend's 12-year-old daughter, stepped out with a basket of hymn sheets tucked under one arm. She asked whether the storm would truly come. Cain answered with the plainness he used for measurements. He said weather did not owe certainty to any soul, but preparation had never ruined a household. He asked her to tell her mother to keep 2 extra water pails full each night. Ruthie nodded once and repeated the instruction aloud, committing it to memory. 3 days later, as the first freight delay notice reached town, Silas sold coal and lamp oil at ordinary rates for 48 hours, and then raised both nearly half, arguing that scarcity had its own honest mathematics. Families who had deferred purchase paid because they had no alternative. Those with credit lines signed new figures in the ledger under lamplight, shoulders tight, mouths set. By November 2nd, women compared receipts in whispers outside the wash pump and discovered that fear was being charged by the pound. No one challenged Silas publicly. His store remained the only store. Cain spent those same days finishing alterations he had intended only for himself. He added interior sand baffles behind both bunks, narrow partitions of scrap plank creating dead air pockets that reduced draft pull when the outer door opened. He set 3 water casks along the south wall, each raised on brick to keep the bottoms from sweating and freezing. He stretched a hemp rope from his lintel post to the church fence, 36 yards by his own measure, and tied cloth markers every 6 feet so a gloved hand could count distance in whiteout. When asked by passing teamsters whether he expected to tow himself to Sunday sermon like a blind man, he answered without heat that rope did not care what name it was called. On November 9th, after a thaw that turned streets to brown ruts, Cain invited any household head to observe a simple test at dusk. Outside temperature stood at 9 degrees by his instrument. Inside his sand-lined room, with stove draft damped and no fresh fuel added for 2 hours, the wall-side reading held at 52 degrees. He showed the thermometer himself, then moved it to the opposite corner and recorded 49. He explained thermal lag in labor terms, not in school terms. What took effort to heat took effort to cool. 3 souls attended the demonstration. One was Ruthie. One was Louis Gant, a widowed stock hand of 68 years, who came mostly to warm his knuckles and stayed to ask practical questions about shovel width and tamping rhythm. The third was Edith Harrow, the schoolteacher, who copied the measurements into her attendance ledger margins between arithmetic marks and penmanship scores. By the second week of November, children had begun digging shallow mock burrows near the wagon yard, calling them sand coffins and laughing when they collapsed in wet clay. Adults corrected none of it. Social order in new towns was often maintained by ridicule long before law entered the matter, and Cain occupied that useful position where a community placed one man so everyone else could feel sensible together. He sold 2 spare wool blankets for $3.40, bought 320 pounds of oats, and repaired lamp chimneys with wire guards cut from old fencing so a single bump would not blacken a room at the wrong hour. He spoke little. He worked by lantern after dark. At dawn and dusk he continued the same entries: wind, drift shape, cloud grain, pressure. Silas kept extending credit for imported goods he could not replace quickly, spacing coffee tins with gaps hidden by labels turned outward, and topping flour barrels with better meal over chaff-heavy lower sacks. Display still suggested abundance. Storage told another story. On January 5th, the telegraph line failed at Medicine Bow after ice-loaded wires came down in crosswind, and rail service halted twice in 3 days with drifts over track cuts west of town. That evening, Cain stood in the church vestibule again, while men shook snow from hats and argued about mule feed, and he said with no flourish that the next storm would not be endured in pride. Several looked away rather than answer. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today, friend. Whether you live where winter still carries teeth, or where weather tests homes in other ways, These frontier lessons endure because the underlying trade-offs do not change. Subscribe so you do not miss what follows. Now, back to the story. The days that followed offered one more false kindness. On January 10th, near sunset, the wind dropped with unnatural completeness. Smoke climbed straight from stovepipes and did not bend. Loose snow at street corners lay still as sifted meal in a bin. Even dogs stopped barking and listened. Kane checked both barometers, then checked them again with a lantern held close. The mercury had fallen from 18 to 4 by the time church bells marked 8 o'clock, and still the town sat in that brittle, quiet men mistake for safety. He changed his plan in that hour. Until then, his preparations had been household scale, designed to preserve one man, 2 mules, and whatever neighbor reached his door by chance. He now laid out a salvage arrangement for many. He set 2 freight sleds beside his entry, runners waxed and ropes coiled. He hung kettle hooks in sequence along the interior beam so 3 pots could run at once without crowding the stove face. He portioned ration sacks by strict weight, flour in 5-pound wraps, beans in 3-pound wraps, salt in quarter-pound twists, pork in marked strips, each parcel tagged for 1 day at controlled issue. He stacked bricks near the stove to preheat for bed warming and for infants if needed. He set a slate board beside the door to log arrivals and fuel burn intervals. Ruthie Pike came at his request, scarf tied across her nose, boots caked in old drift. Kane gave her 12 folded notices addressed to block captains and asked whether she could deliver each by hand before full dark. She could. The notices were plain instructions written in large script. Tie household doors from inside at night so exterior drifts could not jam them shut. Fill all vessels with water before sleep. Prepare to move elders and infants at first light if pressure fell again. Once visibility failed, follow the rope line from church fence to Caldwell lot and not the street center where drifts would hide wells and cutouts. Ruthie tucked the packet beneath her coat and ran. Silas intercepted 1 notice on Willow Lane, tore it in 2, and told the gathered men that Kane was staging a campaign for gratitude. If a merchant had sold fear as inventory, he said, he would have been denounced as a thief. Yet here was Caldwell marketing dread for admiration. The line landed with some because pride required fresh language each day to defend old mistakes. By midnight, the temperature had collapsed to -26. Window glass crazed in 2 of the largest houses on Front Street, fine panes spidering at the edges where indoor heat met hard air with no mass behind the boards. A barn roof on the east lots lifted in gust pulse and settled askew. If you are enjoying this story, friend, hit that hype button right now. It costs nothing, takes a second, and helps this channel carry more stories of hard-earned wisdom and hard-weather mercy. Now, back to the story. Kane did not return to town argument. He banked his stove in measured layers, hardwood, then coal, then ash cap, so heat would hold through repeated door openings. He harnessed the chestnut mule team with double traces and wrapped their necks in burlap under the collars to prevent rub when ice stiffened leather. He checked the rope line knots with bare fingertips despite the bite of metal. Inside, he set the first kettle to simmer and placed 12 tin cups in a row on the bench. Then he sat on an upturned grain crate near the door, coat buttoned, gloves on, hat brim low, listening to the first thin rattle of driven snow against the outer planks, and he waited for the knock he had always known would come. The first knock did not come at once. What came first was the storm announcing itself by increments. A dry hiss against the outer planks, then a harder pebbled strike as snow grains turned sharp in the wind, then the low timber complaint of a town beginning to shrink under cold. Kane rose from the grain crate, lifted the barometer glass toward the lamp, and watched the needle settle lower than any reading he had written since autumn. He crossed to the stove, opened the draft 1 finger width, and laid 2 split lengths of seasoned cottonwood across the coal bed at right angles so the burn would spread slow and even instead of flaring. Heat management, Elsbeth had written, was not fire, but sequence. He checked the kettle hooks, then measured flour again by hand scale, leveling each 5-pound ration sack with the side of a tin cup, not trusting sight in lamplight when fatigue could steal precision. Ruthie Pike came through the rear service hatch 10 minutes later with her mother, both wrapped in wool capes crusted white at the hem. Kane admitted them, dropped the hatch bar, and set their gloves near the warming bricks. Ruthie reported in short, steady phrases, as instructed earlier, naming each block captain and each answer. 3 households had tied their doors and filled barrels. 4 said they would decide at dawn. 2 men on Front Street had laughed and asked whether Caldwell planned to invoice the weather. Silas had stood in his doorway with a lantern held high and told those gathered that panic would freeze more souls than wind. Reverend Pike had ordered the church stove fed through the night, but he had not rung the bell for relocation, saying that formal alarm without visible storm would scatter judgment and invite blame. Kane wrote each report on slate beside the door, then thanked Ruthie by name and instructed her mother to keep the child inside the church vestry, if they returned, beside the brick wall and away from the outer windows. He gave them 1 ration sack and 2 preheated bricks wrapped in flannel before they left by rope. The mother's hand looped through the line marker every 6 feet. By 1 in the morning, the interior thermometer still held at 50 degrees, though the exterior reading had fallen past -30, and Kane began converting his 1-room shelter into a flow space for many bodies. He unpinned the cot frame and stacked the slats vertical against the east wall to open floor area for pallet rows. He marked sleeping zones in chalk on plank floorboards, nearest stove for infants and elders, then women with children, then labor men nearest the door where cold pulses entered. He suspended a wool curtain 6 feet inside the entry to create a crude airlock, reducing direct draft with each opening. He set 1 ash bucket for stove waste, 1 for melted snow, and 1 for refuse, because disorder in confinement bred sickness faster than hunger. At the water casks, he measured headspace with a marked dowel, then topped each with ladle pours from the snow kettle, so that morning use would not expose empty lower seams to freezing split. Every action had a written place in the ledger. Every place had a reason. Outside, social order held longer than weather permitted. Front Street lanterns still burned in a row at that hour, small amber points wavering behind blown crystals, and from the mercantile porch came voices carried in torn gusts. Silas had gathered 6 men under his awning and turned necessity into spectacle, promising to open his coal cage at first light if payment came in coin and not ledger promises. He called across the street toward 2 women hurrying with buckets that Coldwater had survived worse than rumor, and would survive this as well if souls kept their wits. A younger ranch hand repeated the old phrase, "sand coffin," with a broad grin that vanished when the wind slapped snow into his teeth. Even then, mockery did not break. It thinned, stumbled, and resumed. Pride was often most stubborn at the edge of evidence. Kane stepped out once to inspect the rope anchors, leaning his weight into the gusts, boots finding the packed path by memory and knot count. He retied marker cloth at the church fence post, with doubled half hitches so gloved fingers could find orientation by feel alone. At the school corner, he paused and looked toward the stock pens. The horses stood hindquarters to wind in a tight inward ring, heads low, tails ice-rimed into stiff cords, and the barn dogs had ceased barking entirely, pressing beneath wagons with noses tucked hard against forelegs. He noted a pale halo around the moon, and then watched it disappear behind fast upper cloud moving opposite the ground drift, a layered shear Elsbeth had called the split knife. Weather was no longer approaching. It was assembling overhead. When Kane returned inside, 2 more knocks sounded in quick succession, then stopped as if the visitors had reconsidered while waiting. He opened to find Louis Gant at the threshold with a shovel over one shoulder, scarf frozen at the mouth. Louis did not ask for entry. He asked for method. Kane handed him a coil of spare hemp and demonstrated in the doorway out of wind how to tie a door pull from interior latch to bedpost so drift pressure could be broken by leverage rather than shoulder force. He added one instruction without ornament. If visibility failed, leave the barn by rope and never by memory. Louis nodded, repeated the steps aloud, and said he had one gray mare too old to stand loose in open yard. He would secure her and return if needed. Kane pressed 2 hand warmers of heated stone into his mittens and watched him vanish into white grain. A quarter hour later, Edith Harrow arrived with her ledger bag under one arm and a roll of slate pencils in waxed cloth. She had moved school primers to the lower shelves and banked the schoolhouse stove with green wood in error, producing smoke and little heat. Kane corrected her fuel order on the spot, dry split first, then coal cap, then ash seal, and gave her one of his wire chimney guards to reduce breakage if the draft surged. Edith listened with the same severe attention she gave arithmetic recitations. She did not ask him to accompany her. She said only that if families brought children at dawn, the schoolhouse must have at least one warm room. Kane answered that the rope line would remain from his door to church fence and that any overflow should be redirected south to his lot the moment windows iced from inside. She tightened the ledger strap and left into gusting dark, shoulders angled forward like a laborer under load. By 2 in the morning, the wind shifted 10 degrees north and gained force enough to drive snow beneath eaves despite the overhang, and Kane installed his final interior baffle behind the stove wall, using pre-cut plank tongues and sandfill he had kept in feed sacks near the rear berm. He slit each sack, poured the dry sand into the cavity through a narrow funnel board, tamped with a rounded mallet, then sealed the cap seam with lime ash paste, warmed by lantern heat so it would bond before freezing. The added mass cost him 40 minutes and 2 torn gloves. It also flattened heat loss along the north wall by nearly 3 degrees within an hour, as shown by his corner thermometer. Technical skill in that room was not elegance, it was margin. In town, dismissal turned to argument as household conditions diverged. Structures with thicker walls and lower draft held tolerably. Light-framed houses with decorative trim and shallow foundations bled warmth at every joint. Some men accused others of hoarding coal. Others blamed the council for delay without naming how they had voted when delay was chosen. At the church hall, Reverend Pike finally rang the handbell not as alarm, but as call for prayer, and families arrived carrying bedding rolls and kettles, still believing the stone foundation and high roof would serve as common refuge. Kane sent 2 written notes by adults already moving that way. Keep doors closed in strict intervals, assign 1 doorkeeper only, and begin transfer of elders before dawn. 1 note reached the hall, the other never did. It was found later, crusted in drift against a fence rail with the ink blurred but legible. Toward 3, Silas himself crossed to Kane's lot with his collar up and a wool blanket wrapped over his coat, not yet supplicant, still merchant. He asked whether Kane would sell 20 sacks of oats and 10 of flour from private stores at a fair rate to be distributed through the mercantile at daybreak. Kane answered that he would not sell by market while rail was cut and weather closing. He would issue rations by household count from this doorway if conditions failed, and Silas could carry that instruction to any who asked. Silas stiffened at the refusal of terms rather than substance, said that order required central accounting, and warned that private distribution would breed accusations by noon. Kane replied with a sentence he had used once before and never raised. Let them talk. Words do not keep out the wind. Silas held his stare a moment, then turned away, boots slipping once on drifted plank as he regained the street. The warning signs accelerated with no room left for interpretation. Frost feathers formed on interior nails in poorly sealed houses, a sure marker that heat had been driven out of wall cavities. Lamp chimneys cracked in rooms where drafts pulsed from floorboards. At the south pens, a water trough froze from rim to center in less than 40 minutes despite frequent breaking, indicating both temperature collapse and crosswind exposure beyond ordinary January range. Kane logged each sign, time marked by the church bell quarter hours when sound still traveled. He took no satisfaction in being correct. Correctness in such weather was merely burden proved true. Near 4 o'clock, the first true line of evacuees emerged from the dark, not as a crowd, but as fragmented pairs bound by rope and urgency. A mother with 2 boys reached the church fence and could not find the next marker until Kane stepped out with a lantern hooded in tin, guiding them by shouted numbers. An older couple arrived with 1 trunk between them and abandoned it 3 yards from the door when the lid iced shut. Kane admitted each without tallying reputation. He assigned pallets, issued broth by half cup, and rotated wet gloves to the warming line in order of exposure. His slate board filled with names and fuel intervals. The stove face glowed dull red. The walls held steady. Then, just before first light should have thinned the dark but did not, a hard strike sounded on the outer door, followed by another and then a hoarse call nearly lost in wind. Kane lifted the bar, opened against drift pressure with both shoulders, and saw 3 figures clinging to the rope beyond the threshold, while snow drove sideways like sand from a broken blast furnace. Behind them, Front Street had vanished entirely. Only roofs and chimney tops marked where houses stood. The storm had come in full measure, and Coldwater's hour of pretending had ended. Kane braced the door with his hip and pulled the first figure through the drift lip, then the second, then the third. Each one bent nearly double beneath wind that no longer moved like weather, but struck like thrown gravel. Snow streamed into the entry gap, hissed against stove iron, and vanished in steam. He dropped the bar, set shoulders against the planks until the latch seated, and turned to the 3 arrivals as Ruthie lifted the lantern higher. They were Harlan Boyd, his sister-in-law Nora Boyd, and old Mrs. Talley from the South Lane, all roped together at the waist with harness line, all breathing in short, ragged pulls that smoked and froze at once on wool scarves. Kane cut the line free, moved them behind the curtain baffle, and gave each a heated brick wrapped in cloth before he asked a single question. Outside, dawn should have begun at 7:20 by the almanac. No dawn came. On January 11th, 1888, the blizzard closed over Coldwater in a white-black dimness that erased fences, alleys, and the distance between roofs. Kane checked the exterior thermometer nailed under his eave by opening the peephole shutter no wider than 2 fingers. The column stood at -34. Wind drove past from the north-northwest, hard enough to hum through nailheads and rope knots, and by his anemometer wheel, rigged crude from tin vanes and counted by timed revolutions, sustained force held near 58 miles per hour, with stronger bursts. He marked the figures on slate, then on paper, because paper endured longer than memory when panic began to rewrite facts. The first structural failures came within an hour. A shallow-roofed shed behind the boarding house collapsed under loaded drift and cross-gust, spilling feed sacks into a trench of blown powder no one could reach. The 2 chimney stacks on Front Street cracked at their upper courses where green mortar had never cured fully, and smoke that should have risen clear rolled downward along walls and found its way into sleeping rooms. Doors that opened inward became traps as exterior drifts packed against thresholds like tamped earth. Men shouldered them, cursed the jam, and lost heat with each attempt. At the church hall, where Reverend Pike had concentrated families for prayer and mutual aid, orderly entry became a hazard when frightened arrivals kept forcing the south door and pulling warm air into the storm in long, punishing drafts. The bell rope froze stiff in the vestibule. Silas Pemberton's mercantile, built for display and trade rather than siege, failed in the exact sequence Kane had warned against. Its broad front windows, clear and expensive, bled heat faster than the stove could replace it. The back storeroom door warped as moisture in the sill froze and lifted one hinge pin free. Oil lamps set too close to the draft lane shattered chimneys one by one when cold gusts knifed across the room. By mid-morning, shelves that looked full in half-light told the truth under close hand. Flour barrels cut with chaff, coffee tins mostly air, coal cage nearly spent. Silas ordered strict rationing at coin price and then at any price. Families paid in silver, then in promissory slips, then in wedding brooches and carved tools. There was less to sell each hour, and his authority thinned with his inventory. By mid-morning, the rope line from Kane's door to the church fence had become the only reliable path in the north block. Souls moved on it by touch, not sight. Mittened hands counting cloth ties in 6-foot intervals as wind erased footprints before the next boot could fall. Kane ran the line in measured relays with 2 laborers who had reached him early, Jonas Reed and Millie Carver, each relay no longer than 7 minutes outside, before forced return to warm breath and fingers. Inside, the dug room held between 47 and 55 degrees, despite constant opening, the sand mass giving back what the stove had stored through the night. He fed the fire by schedule, not by fear. One split length every 20 minutes, coal cap every third cycle, ash control at the draft edge to prevent runaway burn. Water casks stayed fluid, broth stayed hot, the walls held. At the church, not all plans endured. Reverend Pike tried to keep families together in pew rows by household, but cold and hunger dissolved that order into raw need. Mothers pressed children toward the stove rail. Older men stood in door gaps to block draft and gave up feeling in their hands by degrees. When a gust tore one shutter loose from the west window, drift poured through and coated hymnals and floorboards in a hard crust. Edith Harrow left her place near the front pew, wrapped attendance cards in oilcloth, and volunteered to cross to the schoolhouse, where she believed the stone foundation might shelter 6 of her youngest pupils, with their parents. She tied a scarf across her mouth, took a lantern, and stepped onto what had been Main Street at 9:40. She never reached the school door. They found her at dusk, seated upright against the lee wall, cards still bound beneath her coat to keep them dry, her back straight as if she were waiting for the morning bell. Louis Gant fought for his animals first, exactly as he had promised at Kane's threshold hours earlier. In the barn passage behind his lot, he cut the gray mare loose and slapped her toward the lower shed where walls were thicker, then turned to free a second horse whose halter knot had iced hard. The passage drifted while he worked. By the time neighbors forced the side gate with a fence rail and dragged him clear, his breathing had gone shallow and intermittent. Kane warmed bricks, set them at Louis's ribs and feet, and fed him spoon broth through cracked lips, but the old stock hand died before noon, with one mitten still closed around the halter knife. The mare survived. She stood all day with her nose against the shed wall, trembling but alive. Cold water counted suffering in quieter ways as well. Kettles boiled dry because fuel ran out while eyes were closed in exhaustion. Boots froze beside beds and could not be forced on swollen feet when movement became necessary. Families with no water stored indoors, melted drift snow in tin pans, and drank it too quickly, then weakened from the chill that followed. Coal dust, lamp smoke, and fear turned rooms sour and close. In houses without mass behind their planks, interior frost blossomed on nailheads and spread in white petals across wallpaper seams, a warning sign Elsbeth had written years before, and Kane had shown to anyone willing to learn. Few had learned. Now they watched that frost and understood too late what it meant. Shortly after 1 in the afternoon, a section of the mercantile roof over the rear storeroom gave way beneath drift weight and fell across stacked crates of sugar and lamp oil. No one was crushed, but the impact burst 2 oil tins and turned the floor into a slick hazard where lantern light could have ended the entire block. Silas ordered the lamps doused and stood in near dark with inventory ledger in one hand and a crowbar in the other, trying to pry open the front door that had frozen to its frame from the outside. It would not move. By then, the store had ceased to be a center of provision. It had become a box with dwindling breath. 3 days had seemed an abstraction when Kane had warned the council in autumn. By the second day of storm, duration became the enemy itself. Through the first 37 continuous hours of blizzard force, he logged arrivals, departures, fuel use, and ration issue in columns that grew crowded and slanted as sleep thinned. He admitted every soul who reached the line, set strict rotation for stove proximity by vulnerability, and assigned work to preserve dignity where despair threatened to take hold. Bucket detail, glove drying, broth stirring, ash clearing, child quieting, elder watch. No one received comfort without duty except the infirm. Discipline reduced fear more reliably than speeches. Near first light on January 12th, when the wind had not weakened but shifted enough to scour Front Street nearly bare in places and pile drifts to eaves in others, Ruthie heard a dull, repeated thud at the outer door. Not a fist, a shoulder. Kane lifted the bar and leaned against drift pressure until a narrow opening cleared. Silas Pemberton fell through the gap without hat or gloves, coat half-buttoned, beard rimed white, fingers stiff and dark at the tips from exposure. Pride had been stripped clean by weather and consequence. He did not bargain. He did not mention price. He said with visible effort between breaths that 2 women and a boy were trapped in the mercantile rear room and that he could not free the front door alone. Kane closed the door against the gust, wrapped Silas's hands in warmed cloth, and listened to the report twice to fix distances and obstacles. Then he assembled a rescue team without ceremony. Jonas Reed for leverage, Millie Carver for rope control, Harlan Boyd for sled pull, and Silas himself if he could stand and obey instruction. Kane tied each rescuer to the main line with short tethers to prevent separation in crosswind, added a secondary trace from his belt to Silas's so the merchant could not stagger off course, and handed Millie the hooded lantern with strict order to shield flame at every gust break. They moved as one knot through white turbulence toward a building that had once represented security and now represented entrapment. The mercantile door yielded only after Jonas and Kane worked the hinge side with a pry bar, while Harlan heaved on rope from the lee angle. Inside, cold had settled like quarry stone. They found the 2 women, Clara Dent and Mrs. Willow Ames, crouched beneath a counter with the boy between them, all 3 wrapped in grain sacks and nearly voiceless. Kane checked each airway, set warmed stones into their blankets, and ordered immediate extraction. No salvage of goods, no delay for ledgers or lockboxes. Silas looked once toward his cash drawer, then toward the child shivering in Clara's lap, and followed Kane's order without protest. By noon on January the 13th, the storm finally slackened from a weapon to weather. Wind fell below 20 miles per hour. Light returned in a flat, exhausted gray. Cold water emerged in fragments, roofs half buried, streets carved into corridors, fences erased, chimneys broken, teams missing, hands bandaged, eyes hollow from 2 nights without certainty. Burial crews formed before supper, not by decree but by necessity. Edith Harrow was laid beside the schoolyard she had kept with exacting care. Louis Gant was buried with his halter knife wrapped in cloth above his chest. Nora Boyd, who had reached Kane's door in the first group and endured 2 days of hard breathing after exposure, survived under steady warming and watch. But infant Samuel Boyd, brought in blue-lipped and gasping, died that evening of exposure-related respiratory failure despite heat, steam, and every measure Kane could stage. When the last body that day was covered and the shovels were set upright and drifted ground, Silas came to Kane's threshold again, hands bandaged, voice raw, and asked not for shelter this time but for instruction on how to keep the remaining souls alive through the next week. Kane stepped aside so he could enter the warm room, pointed to the ration board, the fuel schedule, and the wall thermometers, and began to teach. He began with measures, not consolation. Kane set Silas beside the slate board, placed a stub of chalk in his bandaged hand, and made him copy the fuel order twice. Split wood, then coal, then ash cap, with door openings timed and logged. He set Jonas Reed to door duty, Millie Carver to broth, Ruthie Pike to name tally, and Harlan Boyd to cask watch, so no vessel stood half full and froze at the seam. He issued flour by household count in 5-pound wraps, beans in 3-pound wraps, and salt in 1/4-pound twists, each mark entered before the parcel left his hand. When a man asked for extra pork on account of his size, Kane pointed to Louis Gant's empty pallet and said that weather did not weigh souls by pride. Silas listened and wrote. He had once priced coal by fear from a polished counter. Now he repeated burn intervals while melted snow dripped from his coat hem into a dirt tray by the stove. Kane showed him the wall thermometer at the north bunk, then the one by the door curtain, explaining that the 14 inches of dry sand did not make warmth but held it long enough for discipline to matter. He walked him through the baffle seams, the stone flue collars, the lime ash tallow sealant pressed into every joint. "Fine glass leaks faster than rough timber," he said, and Silas, whose broad windows now sat starred and useless over a dim store floor, nodded without defense. By dawn on January 14th, with wind reduced and visibility stretched to half a block, the shelter shifted from siege to system. Kane sent paired teams along the rope to identify trapped households, carrying pry bars, handsaws, and warmed stones wrapped in flannel. Doors were dug free from the hinge side first, never from the latch side, because drift pressure locked latch boards like clamps. One by one, families came through the baffle curtain and into the ordered heat. The Dent brothers with frostbitten ears, Widow Ames with her youngest tied under her shawl, Reverend Pike exhausted and hoarse from 2 nights of prayer and snow hauling. No one entered without assignment. Those strong enough worked, those weak enough rested. The room held because it was governed. Tell us where you are watching from today, friend. If weather has ever taught your household humility, you already understand this frontier arithmetic. Subscribe so you do not miss the final turns of this account. Now, back to the story. 3 days passed before Coldwater could count itself plainly. Burial teams cut lanes through drifts packed hard as tamped meal, and names were read at the church in a voice that did not rise. Edith Harrow, Louis Gant, and Samuel Boyd were entered in the ledger on facing pages, black ink still wet where tears had touched the margin. Kane attended each service, stood at the rear, and returned to ration work before the last hymn finished. Grief in winter required both ceremony and labor. As streets reopened, the contrast between appearance and preparedness stood in full public view. The Mercantile's painted facade remained upright, but half its stock had spoiled or split, and its accounts were a thicket of promises no stove could burn. Kane's dug room, plain and half set into earth, still held steady temperatures with a fraction of the fuel. Men who had laughed at tamping now asked for shovel width and board spacing. Women who had once repeated sand coffin in the wash line arrived with notebooks, asking how to seal seams where plank met sill. Carpenters who had framed two-story houses on Front Street volunteered labor on the North Rise, cutting double walls and carrying sand in feed sacks without charge for households that had lost breadwinners. The reckoning did not arrive as one dramatic tribunal. It arrived as altered conduct, repeated until no one could deny it. Borrowed kettles came back, scrubbed and dry. Rope coils were returned rewrapped and labeled by length. Families who had ignored Kane's notices now sent older sons to learn how to tie interior door pulls and lay gravel skirts against thaw water. Children stopped digging mock burrows by the wagon yard. The phrase Caldwell Walls entered conversation first as a practical shorthand, then as instruction passed to newcomers before first frost. Silas changed most visibly and most slowly. On January 17th, he opened the Mercantile for 4 hours and posted a board outside with fixed prices equal to the week before the storm. He sold lamp oil, coal scraps, and cloth at those rates to widows first, then to households with infants, accepting coin where coin existed and work notes where it did not. He closed each day at dusk and carried his ledger to Kane's table, asking him to inspect ration weights and spoilage loss. Pride remained in him, but it had been cut down to usable timber. If Wild West retribution has become part of your week, friend, consider joining the channel membership. A few dollars a month keeps stories like this alive and in front of more folks who value them. Now, back to the story. On the first Sunday of February, when daytime temperature rose to 19 degrees and the church windows no longer iced from the inside, Reverend Pike called for open ledger after service. The congregation remained seated. Silas stood near the pulpit rail with both hands visible. Bandages gone, but fingertips still darkened at the edges. He spoke without flourish, and because he had traded in language for years, everyone heard the cost of plainness in his voice. I named your work Caldwell's Sand Coffin. From my porch, when I still believed that polished boards and full shelves were the same thing as readiness. I sold cold deer when fear rose, and I called that arithmetic. During the storm, my door froze shut, my stock failed, and my judgment failed before both. I carried my own warning as a torn notice in my coat, and still would not read it until weather stripped me of choice. This town lost Edith Harrow, who walked out to keep children warm, and Louis Gant, who freed his mare before himself, and little Samuel Boyd, who had barely entered this life before winter took him. I cannot ask those names for pardon. I can only state before this ledger that my conduct made hard days harder. I will fund at cost and from my own remaining account a public storage cellar by church ground. Any soul may inspect the books. Any soul may learn the method I mocked. No one applauded. The silence held like a tool held steady in a practiced hand. Others spoke in the weeks that followed, some in the church hall, many at Kane's doorway. A ranch wife admitted she had laughed when her boys copied his digging and asked to buy sand by wagon load. A carpenter said he had called the rope line coward's work and then followed it on his knees to save his mother. Reverend Pike confessed that he had delayed alarm to protect order and had mistaken order for wisdom. Not every soul apologized in words. Some brought labor. Some brought timber. Some brought only a changed face and quiet attention. A few never came at all. Their absence was also part of the record. Kane answered each approach with the same conditional offer. He would teach any household willing to measure, dig, and share stores by rule, and he would refuse any household that sought only private advantage without communal duty. When asked whether he forgave the town, he did not grant a quick absolution. He stood by the stove, palm resting on the warm, sand-filled wall, and said that Elsbeth taught him shelter was a craft and covenant, not a favor traded for courtesy. "Your words injured me," he said one evening to a cluster of men who had mocked him loudest, "and I will not pretend they did not. But I did not build this room for revenge. If you want warmth next winter, bring a shovel at sunup." By mid-March, ground crews had cut the communal cellar trench on church land. 42 feet long, 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep, timber braced at 4-foot intervals, with sod lining and 2 hatch points exactly as Kane's autumn plan had specified. Silas paid invoices at cost from a pared-down account book. Kane supervised wall fill and vent placement, then handed instruction to younger carpenters, so the knowledge did not remain in one set of hands. Ruthie Pike, still 12 but now treated as a working messenger rather than a child to be hushed, kept the tool ledger and corrected grown men when they miscounted tie spacing on safety lines. Years moved in measured increments after that winter. By the second week of October each year, Coldwater households checked fuel bins, sealed seams, and logged water stores as routine, not spectacle. New houses on Front Street included sand cavities or earth berms, even where owners preferred painted trim. Builders charged by honest material and labor, and buyers asked for thermal mass before they asked for window size. The town census in 1902 counted 489 souls. The increase came not from luck, but from habits that reduced winter loss. Kane did not seek office. He remained on the North Rise, adding a second room, then a workshop where he copied Elsbeth's notebooks into cleaner volumes for church archives and school use. He trained 3 apprentices in wall packing, flue collars, and ration accounting. Millie Carver, who became the best stove tender in the county. Jonas Reed, who standardized rope routes block by block, and Ruthie Pike, who taught weather logs to schoolchildren each autumn alongside arithmetic. Silas kept the mercantile open under stricter books and never again raised storm prices above posted preseason rates. He died in 1909 with one final entry in his ledger's front leaf: "Display is not preparedness." The communal cellar still stands on church ground, timber darkened, hatch iron worn smooth by generations of gloved hands. Over its lintel, carved in plain letters and recut whenever weather softens the grain, are the words Kane chose from Elsbeth's notes and the town accepted as law: "What holds heat holds life." Thank you for watching, friend. If this story reminded you that practical wisdom can outlast pride, share it with someone who needs that lesson, and subscribe for more stories of frontier resilience. Tell us in the comments, friend, has anyone ever warned your community in time, only to be heard after the storm? No one in Coldwater mistook the lesson for complete when the graves were filled, because survival after a storm required an accounting as strict as the preparations that had carried them through it. On January 15th, with daylight finally steady enough to work full hours outdoors, Kane brought the slate board from his wall to a table in the church hall and copied every figure into the public ledger. 83 ration sacks issued, 26 returned empty and folded, 19 returned with untouched portions from households that had lost appetite and grief, 11 kettles borrowed and brought back, 4 rope coils frayed beyond safe use, 2 sled runners cracked, 1 lantern lost in drift near the mercantile alley. He listed the stores that remained in his dug room as carefully as the stores consumed: 3 casks of water, 1.5 sacks of flour, 9 pounds of beans, 7 strips of pork, enough coal for 5 days at reduced burn. In the casualty column of that same ledger, He entered that Nora Boyd, pulled in alive with the first evacuee group, died after prolonged exposure effects and was to be memorialized with the storm dead. Modest provision had outlasted expensive display. The contrast required no speech. That same afternoon, the telegraph clerk received first contact from Medicine Bow after the line failure, a clipped report confirming what Kane had warned in October. Rail cars with coal and flour had stood snowbound west of Laramie for 41 hours, while Coldwater had argued over confidence and cost. Reverend Pike read the report aloud at evening prayer, then folded it into the church archive beside the torn notice found at the fence rail, ink blurred but still legible where it instructed families to tie interior door pulls and fill water before sleep. Ruthie Pike asked leave to copy both documents into school copybooks so older pupils would read them each November. No one objected. The town had learned to treat paper as memory made durable. By the 4th week of January, the work of rescue became the work of reconstruction, and Kane refused to let either drift into sentiment. He opened his lot each morning at sunup to any soul willing to learn by hand. Sand was screened through 1/4-inch mesh and poured dry, never damp. Cavity width held at 14 inches on north and west faces, 10 inches on the south where winter sun could assist. Stove flues passed through stone collars bedded in lime and ash. Seams were sealed with warm tallow mixture pressed deep, then capped with battens. Millie Carver demonstrated draft control with a watch and chalk marks. Jonas Reed laid new rope routes from church to school to boarding house, marker ties at 6-foot intervals, each knot tested by gloved pull. Silas carried sand sacks with the same bandaged hands that had once counted profit margins, and when men paused to watch him labor, he did not look up. The reckoning hardened into words on the first Sunday of February, not because anyone desired public humiliation, but because hidden shame had already proved itself dangerous. Reverend Pike called the open ledger again and asked each household head who had mocked, delayed, or profited to state record and remedy. A ranch foreman rose first and admitted he had laughed at the rope line until he crawled along it to reach his mother's door in whiteout. A carpenter said he had dismissed sand walls as burial work, then watched his decorative trim split, while Kane's plain boards held temperature. Widow Ames said she had repeated sand coffin in the wash line and now stood alive because that coffin had opened its door at midnight. Silence followed each statement. Then the scratch of Kane's pencil as he entered, remedies offered, labor days, timber at cost, grain contributed to shared stores, stove repair for widowed households. When Silas stepped forward, he did not defend his conduct with the language of trade. He quoted his own mockery without alteration and named his price increases by date and amount, including the near half rise on coal and oil after fear moved through town. Then he set his mercantile keys on the ledger table and declared that any stock remaining in his storeroom would be sold at pre-storm rates under public inspection until spring rail service normalized. He added one statement that altered the room more than his confession had done. He had intercepted one of Kane's warning notices and torn it, and a mother on Willow Lane had therefore never seen evacuation instruction before the wind closed. The mother's husband stood in the third pew with his hat twisting in both hands. He did not speak. He nodded once. The failure had been named where all could hear. Kane spoke last only because Reverend Pike asked it. He stood beside the church stove, palm resting against the warm iron, as if measuring whether the room could bear plain truth. He said Elsbeth Caldwell had written that winter punished vanity first, but punished ignorance last, and that a town could survive either alone, yet not both together. He did not offer easy pardon. He said words spoken from porches and shop counters had done injury that did not vanish with thaw, and he would not pretend otherwise to ease anyone's conscience. Then he gave the condition that became Coldwater's new covenant. He would teach every household willing to measure honestly, store fairly, and share by rule when weather closed. And he would stop teaching the moment a family sought private safety bought by a neighbor's exposure. Forgiveness, he said, was less urgent than obedience to methods that kept children and elders alive. The congregation remained standing after he finished, not in ceremony, but because no one wished to sit first. 3 days later, under a clear sky at 12 degrees below zero, work began on the communal cellar exactly where Kane's autumn plan had been refused. Ruthie kept timesheets at a plank table near the trench. Silas paid timber invoices in coin where he could, and in signed transfer of goods where he could not, each entry countersigned by Jonas Reed and one church deacon, so no price could be altered after dusk. Kane supervised depth and bracing with a surveyor's line and one of the old barometers mounted at hatch height, teaching how pressure shifts guided ventilation and hatch opening schedules during storms. The second barometer he donated to the schoolhouse with Edith Harrow's name inscribed on its frame. Louis Gant's halter knife was set in a shadow box near the cellar stair, not as ornament but as reminder that duty to animals and duty to neighbors were of one piece on that frontier. In October of 1893, when another severe front dropped Coldwater from 34 degrees to -18 in a single night, the town did not improvise and did not panic. Doors were tied from inside before dusk. Water stood ready in casks against south walls. Rope routes were checked by lantern at evening bell. Families moved elders in ordered sequence to structures with mass and controlled draft. No one waited for Silas to announce price, because shared stores had been filled by weighed contribution each harvest and inspected quarterly by rotating teams that included widows, laborers, and clergy. 2 roofs failed under drift load that season, but no soul died from exposure. At spring thaw, new settlers arrived and asked why houses on the North Rise looked plain and thick. Children answered before adults could. Those were Caldwell walls. By 1902, with population at 489 souls, Kane's notebooks had been copied into 3 bound volumes held in separate locations against fire and loss: church archive, school cabinet, and communal cellar chest. Ruthie Pike, now a grown instructor, taught weather logs each autumn by having pupils compare sky forms with barometer readings before supper and again at dawn. Millie Carver oversaw stove inspections block by block each November. Jonas Reed, gray at the temples, maintained rope maps updated after every new fence line. Silas kept his ledger open on market days for any customer to inspect storm pricing history, and he never again altered rates upward once first snow set. When he died in 1909, his will transferred 1/4 of mercantile profits to cellar maintenance and fuel aid, and his first ledger page remained displayed beneath glass with the line he had written in his own hand: "Display is not preparedness." The communal cellar still stands on church ground, hatch iron polished by generations of work-worn gloves, timber dark with age and smoke, sand filled dry and tight in every retrofitted wall that surrounds it. On winter evenings, when wind pushes hard from the North Rise and snow grains hiss along Front Street, Coldwater families check seams, count sacks, and follow rules learned at cost. They speak Edith Harrow's name when schoolchildren practice drill routes, Louis Gant's name when barn doors are cleared before dawn, Nora Boyd's name when intake blankets are checked for breath and heat, and Samuel Boyd's name when infants are moved first toward steady heat. Above the cellar lintel, carved and recut whenever grain softens, the inscription remains plain enough for any passing soul to read: "What holds heat holds life."